The Nuremberg trials were one of the defining moments of the immediate post-war period, when justice was seen to be done to those who'd committed war crimes. For some people, the sight of Slobodan Milošević, the Serbian leader, in the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague was a moment of similar import. But for others, the Hague court was, on the contrary, a travesty of international justice. For one side, then, Slobodan Milošević was the leader of an aggressive Serbian nationalism. He ignited 3 Balkan wars and was ultimately responsible for the killings of thousands and thousands of Croatians, Bosnian Muslims, Kosovars, amongst others. For other people, and they include John Laughland in his new book, Travesty, Milošević is a much misunderstood figure pushed into war by Western powers, and his trial a confirmation that the international justice offered by The Hague is no more than a cover for Western interests. The author John Laughland joins me in the studio, as does the international human rights lawyer Richard Hermer, and down the line from Budapest is Adam LeBor, the biographer of Milošević. I want to begin with you, if I may, John, and cast yourself in as the defence for Milošević, and Adam will act as the prosecutor. We'll bring Richard in later. Tell me, John, what's wrong with the case that Milošević was an aggressive Serbian nationalist responsible for the wars?
Well, in fact, that charge that he was an aggressive nationalist was in fact dropped from the indictment against him in The Hague. He was originally, as you know, accused of committing genocide in Kosovo by the Western powers who attacked Yugoslavia in 1999. But the charge of genocide never made its way into the indictment because that claim, like the claim of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, turned out to be mere war propaganda, and so the prosecutors never even put it into their indictment. As far as the claim about him being an aggressive nationalist and pursuing a greater Serbia and so on is concerned, which dealt with the Bosnia and Croatia parts of the indictment, that allegation was never contained in the indictments either. Greater Serbia was not mentioned in either the Bosnia or the Croatia indictment, and although the prosecutor made rhetorical use of it in his speeches, he was forced to withdraw it formally as an allegation in the middle of the trial.
Adam, you're Milošević's biographer. How sympathetic are you to what John's just said?
Well, I don't agree with it at all, and I think we have to distinguish here very clearly between ideology and rhetoric and what actually happened on the ground. Now, it's extremely likely that Milošević was never a Serbian nationalist, but he used Serbian nationalism to pursue his dream, which was this dismemberment of Yugoslavia, and as part of pursuing that dream, he and his army and his paramilitaries launched wars of aggression against Croatia, against Bosnia, and against Kosovo. So whether or not he was a Serbian nationalist is neither here nor there really. What counts is what happened on the ground, the role of the Serbian state, the role of the Yugoslav army, and in particular the role of the paramilitaries that were armed, funded and trained by the Serbian Secret Service.
John, do you want to respond to that?
Well, of course, Adam LeBor is one of the people who has made this claim that he was a nationalist, and I'm very glad to see that he's now withdrawing it. As far as the phrase his armies is concerned, precisely the issue again with the Croatia and Bosnia wars in the tribunal was whether or not Milošević had any control over the armies which were fighting. Clearly, as president of Serbia, in other words as a regional leader, he had no control over the Yugoslav Federal Army at all when Yugoslavia was breaking up and when Serbia was essentially fighting Croatia. And he had no control either over the Bosnian Serb army, which was engaged in a civil war in Bosnia. So the allegation that Milošević was somehow this evil genius directing everything that was going on in the Balkans simply doesn't stand up to close scrutiny.
Adam?
Well, I just think that's complete nonsense. I mean, if all you have to do is read the accounts that have been documented by human rights organisations, by the United Nations, multiple volumes of reports that delineate very clearly the relationship between the Serbian state, the Serbian army and the paramilitaries. And whether or not I said that Mr. Milošević was a Serbian nationalist, I think is neither here nor there. What I'm saying very clearly is that he exploited Serbian nationalism to pursue his own dream, a dream which was carried out at the expense of the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. But I will agree with one point. It's not fair to put all the blame on him because there were clearly forces within the state who agreed with his plan, in particular the army and the Serbian Secret Service.
John, what about Adam's point, which is there are large numbers of documented kind of evidence? How do you respond to that? It isn't as if people are making this up.
Well, they are making an awful lot up. I mean, they made an awful lot up over Kosovo. As I say, the allegation was that racial genocide was being perpetrated in Kosovo, and I'm sorry, but that allegation turned out to be a lie. It was exactly the same kind of lie as Tony Blair repeated when he told the British people that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. As far as Bosnia and Croatia is concerned, I don't believe that the evidence does exist. What happened in Yugoslavia was that a state collapsed. You had a civil war. You had wars of secession started in Slovenia and Croatia. The Serbs were not the authors of those wars. Of course, Belgrade supported other Serbs in the neighbouring republics, but that has never been denied, least of all by Milošević himself. But to support an army in another state, in international law, certainly in the rulings which exist, does not make you criminally responsible for what that army does.
Adam?
I'd like to ask John Laughland what he feels about the role of the paramilitaries, which carried out many of the atrocities and which were part of the Serbian Secret Service, which were trained by the Serbian Secret Service, and whether he truly believes that these kind of actions, such as took place at Zvornik when the paramilitaries attacked Zvornik, which was inside Bosnia, not inside Serbia, with artillery and sniper support from the Yugoslav army. How could these things have taken place without the knowledge and approval of President Milošević, President of Serbia as he then was?
Well, this issue was raised in the trial, and the evidence for it is exactly the sort of rhetorical question which you have just put. How could it have happened without his knowledge? That isn't sufficient to secure a criminal conviction, and it isn't sufficient either to make an allegation of the kind you're making. If you have evidence that Milošević was a nationalist, or that he was directing these paramilitaries, then you must provide it. You can't just ask rhetorical questions and expect that to prove guilt.
Can I ask you, John, that sometimes the claim of being able to produce enough evidence to go to a criminal court reminds you of the kind of arguments that some people have made to try to free Hitler of the responsibility of what happened in the camps. You must be alert to that as a danger of that your position can be backed into.
Not at all. I don't think there's any comparison at all between Milošević and Hitler, and I think that the sort of ridiculous propaganda about Greater Serbia, which Adam LeBor propagates, only contributes to this very dangerous confusion in people's minds. Milošević never attacked any other state. You know, the state collapsed. There was a civil war. People started fighting each other.
Adam, do you believe that the state collapsed?
The state collapsed because the state was caused to collapse in part by the decisions of the Serbian ruling elite as communism collapsed. And I really wish Mr. Laughland would not keep going on about how I'm a propagandist saying that Slobodan Milošević believed in Greater Serbia. I said repeatedly that I don't believe that he did believe in Greater Serbia, but that he exploited Serbian nationalism to bring together a very diffuse coalition of forces such as the army, the intellectuals, various business potentates who saw it as being within their interest to go to war.
Okay, let us, if we may, because I want to kind of broaden this out and partly bring Richard in. Let's now think about kind of Milošević on trial. I mean, we've chewed away at, as it were, at the history of the 90s in Yugoslavia, and we want to reflect on what the trial tells us about the nature of international justice. Milošević was indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia on the 27th of May 1999, but he died in prison without a judgment having been reached. Now, John and Adam, as I've said, are now joined by Richard. I want to ask you, John, was Milošević given a fair trial, do you think, and if not, why not?
Absolutely not. The trial was so unfair it's difficult to know where to start. The levels of unfairness just pile on top of each other. In my view, the tribunal itself was illegitimate. Its procedures are irredeemably stacked against the defendants, whoever they are. In the specific case of the Milošević trial, of course, it was preceded by a terrible demonization campaign, which makes all rational debate about the issue very difficult. And in his trial, the judges there committed two acts which I think are absolutely disgraceful. The first was to impose a defence lawyer on him and to set things up so that he could be tried in absentia. Trial in absentia is something that we associate with the worst forms of dictatorship and revolutionary justice, and yet now it has pride of place in the jurisprudence of the Hague Tribunal. And they also, of course, refused him medical treatment. They knew that he was sick, He'd been sick ever since he arrived in The Hague. It's the longest criminal trial in history. He was inside for 4 years, and even by then the end was not in sight. And they have now, if you like, established in international law the principle that sick men who are dying should remain in the dock, and I think that's a disgrace.
Richard, I want to bring Adam in as well. Richard, how do you respond to what John said, you as a lawyer?
Well, as Adam disagrees with John on history, so I disagree with John on legal fact. The Milošević trial was an extraordinarily positive moment for humanity. For the first time ever, it brought a serving head of state before an international tribunal to answer charges, not only charges that touched upon the inhabitants of the former Yugoslavia, but charges so grave, so heinous, that they impact upon us all. They are, by their very definition, crimes against humanity. Now, one can look at any trial and one can pick up things that went on that one's not entirely happy with, but this was a 4-year trial, and that almost stands in itself as evidence of the fairness that Milošević received. It was, I think, an extraordinarily fair trial. One or two things that I think they could have done better, but extraordinarily fair. They afforded him every opportunity to put his defence. John raises 2 points, one, the imposition of a defence lawyer, but as John well knows, that didn't stop, nor did it seek to stop Mr. Milošević putting forward a defence on his own. It simply gave the added advantage of having a trained lawyer there to assist upon legal points. And as for medical treatment, well, I think what John means is they didn't agree to his request to go and see his own personal doctor in Russia. Well, I think that was entirely sensible. We wouldn't need to be particularly clever to know what would happen if Mr. Milošević went to Russia. He would never have come back to The Hague.
So you, as a human rights lawyer, you're happy to see defendants die in custody through lack of medical treatment?
Well, I don't think he died because of lack of medical treatment. I don't think anybody seriously is suggesting that he was not given access to proper medical...
On the contrary, it has been precisely suggested by the doctors who were treating him that if he had been treated properly, then he would have survived. He had a very easily treatable heart condition.
John, the Russian doctor who Mr. Milošević wanted to treat him said that. No one is suggesting...
Well, you said no one suggested it. On the contrary, it has been suggested by a very senior Russian doctor who is an academician. So you can't say no one suggested it.
I think he was the doctor put forward by the former Communist Party, and I think he was the doctor who was suggested by the former Communist Party.
So if you're a former member of the Communist Party, you're not allowed to have a medical opinion.
I'm not saying that for a moment, but I think it helps us all give a context to your claim that he wasn't given access to medical treatment. He
died in custody.
Yes, as do lots of people, John, but that doesn't mean you're not given access to proper medical... People die, I'm afraid, John. It's not always the fault of doctors.
He died after a 4-year trial during which his health was a matter of concern from the very beginning. Nobody can claim that it was not known that he was suffering and about to die.
Listen, we've chewed over, and I understand this, but Adam, can you come back, as it were, to some more of the substantive points that John raised?
Well, I'd like to ask him if he thinks that if people are not very well and are medically suffering and need medical treatment, their trials should stop.
Listen, I think that's what's called a rhetorical question, and I don't want to chew away.
Yes. Sick men should not stand trial. That's a well-established principle of law.
And if you're not, overnight our courts will grind to a halt, John.
No, I'm sorry. No, that is completely unfair. If you're not fit enough to attend the courtroom, you cannot be tried. Richard, that is a principle of English law. You cannot be tried in absentia if you are not well enough to attend the court. You cannot
and that's why it took 4 years,
for the very
John,
good reason that you have not instructed your defence counsel, and you cannot therefore present a defence. Well, I mean, it's absolutely monstrous to say otherwise.
Well, John, that's why the trial took 4 years, because the court bent over backwards to ensure that Mr. Milošević was there. It sat for a maximum of 4 hours a day, 3 days a week for the last couple of years of the trial. That's because they had an understanding of what fair justice demanded.
Look, we'll chew away, and we could spend the next 10 minutes chewing away at this, but I suppose I want, there's a kind of an in-principle kernel at the heart of this, really, which is John's argument is that he didn't have a fair trial. That's been contested. The issue, I suppose, the larger issue is a fair trial possible within a kind of international framework, or really is law a matter to exercise within national sovereignty? John, do you think a fair trial is possible inside an international context?
Basically, no. I think trials of political leaders are always fraught with difficulty. The great English constitutionalist Dicey defined the rule of law as a trial a trial in front of the ordinary courts of the land, under the ordinary laws of the land. And history tells us, whether we start with Charles I or Louis XVI or the leaders of the Third Republic tried under Vichy France, that political trials of political leaders, are always, literally without exception in history, called by special courts. And the Hague Tribunal is no exception to this. It's a special court.
But it's a special court different, isn't it? Because it's an international court. The ones you've just presented are at least partially national courts.
Well, the problem with it is that it's special. The international aspect of it, in my view, adds a further difficulty, which is this. In all systems of power, you have the possibility for some sort of change or some sort of reform within the system. For example, in the Soviet Union, as everybody knows, there were show trials under Stalin, and those trials, the victims of those trials, were rehabilitated by a process of internal reform under Khrushchev. That shows the natural organic growth, if you like, of a nation state, understanding its own errors. In the international context, that natural process, which comes from the inevitable link which exists between the powers of the state and the people it governs, can never take place, precisely because an international tribunal is separated structurally from the people it governs, and that's where I think it leads to abuses of power.
Well, look, I take a rather simple view of this. People who commit the most heinous crimes known to mankind, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. Maybe I'm rather simple, but I think they need to be prosecuted and punished.
But Richard,
and
do you think
one second, John. No, let me just finish this point, John. And the problem with your position, which is understandable if misplaced in theory, is that it never leads to prosecutions. It leads to complete impunity from prosecution. And that is why I am very happy to see international courts prosecute heads of state, because the alternative is they're simply, either they're not going to be prosecuted at all, or what you get at the other end of the spectrum is you get the farce that we've seen with the Saddam Hussein trial, which would have been far better run as an international court. But the underlying principle is you either try people in international courts, and in reality they get away with it.
Do you believe in the presumption of innocence?
Yeah, of course I do.
Do you believe Milošević was innocent?
No, personally, I don't believe he was innocent.
But he was not convicted of any crimes.
Well, that's because he died,
and therefore
John.
he was legally innocent.
Well,
if you believe he was legally innocent, you should wish all the safeguards of the legal process to apply to his case.
John,
as a human rights lawyer, naturally you should wish that.
I think most defendants sitting in most criminal courts, domestic criminal courts across this globe, would be delighted to have the safeguards that Milošević had, would be delighted to be able to cross-examine witnesses endlessly, would be delighted to have an amicus, would be a friend of the court appointed, would be delighted to have counsel appointed. Mr. Milošević was probably the most cosseted defendant in not only international criminal history, but probably in any domestic court.
I mean, I wonder, Adam, you've been writing a book recently on the UN. What about, for you, the kind of international dimension? Where do you stand on international courts?
Well, I think it's one of the most positive developments in recent history, the idea that international statesmen and government leaders can be called to account in an international court, which is free from domestic pressures, which is also under immense scrutiny. I mean, let's remember that the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is quite a transparent organisation. You can just have a look at its website to see that. And these trials and these proceedings take place in the full glare of the world, and as the other guest, the human rights lawyer, was saying, the safeguards are extraordinary, and the way Milošević was looked after was also extraordinary. Really, the last thing they wanted was for him to die in custody. Their aim was to have the trial brought to an end, whatever the verdict would be. And I think we're at the start of a new process here, and a very important process, that moving on from the temporary tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda through to the establishment of the International Criminal Court, which is now dealing with Darfur. Now, it's a fact that the names of the 51 Sudanese officials who've been referred to the International Criminal Court, the fact that that's happened is causing all sorts of tensions in Khartoum. People are getting very nervous at the idea they might finally be brought to account, and that can only be a good thing.
Okay, we've talked about Milošević, we've talked about his trial, we've talked about the issue of kind of the principle of international trials. I wonder if we might finally take a kind of step back and wonder about the limits of criminal justice. I mean, Richard, You're a lawyer. Do you think there is a case in Bosnia or in Yugoslavia now for saying no more trials, truth and reconciliation, to use the language of South Africa, is what is really needed? There has to be an end to kind of retributive justice.
Well, there's a tension in any transitional society between having to hold people to account for what had happened and having to move on. And you raised South Africa, where they chose the truth and reconciliation approach. It's a theme that's constant in many societies. From my own perspective, I think there is a overwhelming imperative to criminally prosecute those who are most responsible for the atrocities that have occurred. I think unless you prosecute, you undermine...
And this is however long it takes.
However long it takes, you prosecute. Now, there's a very real practical difficulty, which is why I support, in tandem with prosecutions, truth commissions. And that is, you cannot prosecute everyone. Take Rwanda, for example, in which hundreds of thousands of people were wielding machetes. I mean, it was... if one were to prosecute everybody responsible, it would take... In order to do it properly, it would take Rwanda years and years and years, and they're trying to do it at the moment through some form of local courts, but if you want to do it properly, it would take years. And you just can't do that in a transitional society. So there, I think there is a very proper place for truth commissions, truth and reconciliation commissions, but not at the expense of prosecuting those at the very top of the tree who are most responsible.
John, do you share that view?
Not at all, and indeed I think it's one of the most remarkable phenomenon of the modern world to see people who, I believe, identify themselves as liberals and as defenders of human rights suddenly becoming great enthusiasts for prosecutions. I believe that the Hague Tribunal now is having a very negative effect in Yugoslavia. It was created to promote peace, but in fact it's promoted massive resentment, not just in Serbia but in Croatia and in other parts of Yugoslavia, because nobody wants to see their own war criminals prosecuted, and in particular they don't want to see them prosecuted by international unaccountable institutions. We've had a lot of rhetoric about holding people to account. That's not what the Hague Tribunal does. The Hague Tribunal is precisely an unaccountable institution, and I would plead with people who are deceived by the chimera of international justice to remember that the oldest question in political philosophy, posed by Plato and reposed by Justinian, is this: who guards the guardians themselves?
Richard, you've got about 10-15 seconds to answer that most ancient of questions.
Never mind Plato. What is extraordinary is to say that liberals, a liberal perspective, human rights perspective, ignores the rights of victims. And what human rights is about, and what the movement towards international criminal justice is about, and solely about, is trying to make this world better by bringing those who commit the most heinous crimes to justice. And that's a noble liberal cause.
John Laughland, thank you very much. Adam LeBor down the line from Budapest, and Richard Hermer. John Laughland's book, Travesty, The Trial of Slobodan Milošević and the Corruption of International Justice, is published by Pluto. You're listening to Night Waves here on BBC Radio 3 with me, Philip Dodd. And if you